Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to today's session, today's dialogue session. Welcome to Center 42. Center 42 is a developmental center, art center, dedicated to the promotion, documentation, and creation of text for Singapore theatre. Now, I'm very delighted today to be in conversation with Chay, full name Chay Yew, who has been quite a force in Singapore theatre in terms of the playwriting and has since gone overseas and made a huge impact on the scene there. So for tonight, I just want to have a chat with Chay about his work as a playwright, his work as a director, running arts company in the US, and again, his thoughts about where arts in Singapore was, is, and can be going. So can you please give me a warm welcome to Chay Yew. Right, I'm going to start with asking Chay all the way back to 1987, where back in the 80s, I would credit you, I'm speaking as a theatre historian for Singapore theatre, as one of the first few writers to write the first queer, not just the first queer play to ever be staged in Singapore. And the person who was in that play is here today, Lim Yu Meng. And also the first of the playwrights to actually write about HIV. Right? So I just want to really bring it back to 87 and talk us through, the play is called As If He Hears, but that was not the original title, was it?
No.
It wasn't. Okay, so there's an interesting story behind that, and I want Chay to kind of tell us the story because it gives us the context of what playwrights had to deal with and what theatre companies had to deal with in the 80s to bring very socially relevant and socially aware theatre to Singapore. Chay, go.
Well, the context would be that I came back for NS, and I had spent 4 years in LA studying at Pepperdine University and UCLA. And when I came back, again, the preamble too was that I went to school to study something. And unbeknownst to my father, I studied theater. And then the grades went back to Singapore one day because we had to study in summer. And then he says, "What is this theater movement thing you're doing?" And I said, "It's about the economics of American theater and how it impacts global something."
Well done.
Yeah. And then he said, "If you're going to do that, take some management courses as well," which I did. And while doing it, at some point, I wanted to be an actor, as all of us did. And I realized at some point, while doing it, sometimes I was doing a particular play, and then this professor said, "You're very good at it." And I said, "Why didn't I get the part?" And he says, "Well, you're not white, and this play is about a white family in Britain." And that same afternoon, I changed my major to broadcasting and film. That is the context. So when I came back to Singapore for NS, they were a little, at the time in the 80s, it was a little looser. And there are a lot of newspapers that said, "We're doing a play, there's an audition, would you come do this?" So I did a few of these things. And then I got hooked up with TheatreWorks in its infancy. And the context too for that was, at the time we did a lot of plays, and we did one particular one called Elephant Man. And we did English clothing, English accents. And then one day we had a viewing party for the play that we saw. And we saw this bunch of Asian people basically dressing as white people, speaking in white accents. And I think Lim Xiao Chong,
yeah.
the artistic director, said, "I think it's time to, in a way, to look toward what we should be writing for Singaporeans." And then the next season, he had put a play on in the season, and one of them is called Safe Sex. And I said, "What's that?" Because I could audition for it. So he said, "It's not written yet." And I said, "How much are you paying for a play?" And he says, $500. And I said, "I'll write you one." Again, the context, I go backwards and forwards because that's the way I also write, so forgive me. So when I was in the US, when I went to school, I saved all my money, and every summer I would go to New York for a week and a half to see all the shows. And I love musicals, so one particular summer I saw all the musicals, but I still had some money left. And my friend said, "Would you go see something downtown?" And I said, downtown. I'm not going downtown. He says, you should go check this play out. It's been running for some time. And so I walked into this big, massive theater, and in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, I remember this very clearly, there were only 7 people in the audience, and the cast of 10 or 12 were on stage, but the show went on. And when I sat in the theater, there were names of men on the stage and the set. It's a very bare stage. Around the theater walls were the 50 states of the United States. Next to each state was a number that kept crossing out. 4, cut, 12, cut, 50, cut, 75. And at the end of the play, when I came out of it, my world shifted. The play was The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer. And you realize that that moment, that play, that what I experienced now became the world I stepped into. So that was the first time my world shifted, by, in a way of saying how wonderful musical theater could be, but now I understood what political and realist theater could be. So all that to come to this particular As If He Hears. So having gone through and seen what was happening in the country, I thought my bravado, and to be honest, this is one of the beautiful things about Singapore. When you least expect it, there's so many opportunities because you just don't know where you're looking at. They're just there. And if Xiao Chao didn't say yes, I wouldn't be sitting here. If I wasn't, I was a terrible actor. If he said, you're terrible, don't come, don't be part of our troupe, I wouldn't be sitting here either. So again, that was the 80s when I was only 3. That occurred, that happened. And we turned in this play. And Eleanor Wong wrote the first play called Jackson on the Job. And those 2 plays were submitted to the Ministry of Communication. And it was banned immediately. And I think I was writing in the style of American theater where it was, I wrote everything I felt and I thought. At the time, the lead character was, still is, I guess. I guess it's your character, is it?
Not serious.
I forget.
I think it's his character.
The straight Asian guy was basically
It's Chay Yew.
the straight Asian guy was basically the one with HIV because he went to Thailand. The helper, who was the social worker, was basically a gay character, and the newspapers and the government said that what was it? It was banned because it was a positive portrayal of a homosexual character and it was against the family values of Singapore. And then it hit every place. I said, let's not do it. And then I went back to the United States. While I was driving across the country, King Sen called. And he says, we have to do this play because this thing is coming down from Thailand. And if we don't do it, the country is going to not know what this is all about. And me, being young, arrogant, and like a diva.
Indeed.
Haven't done my tiara yet.
As you do.
Yes, thank you. And I said, artistic integrity, etc., etc., etc. But he says, yeah, you can keep your artistic integrity in one corner, but people are dying. So I drove all the way from the middle country to New York, and I began to figure out how to rewrite the play in my head so that the censors could read something very differently than I wanted. It was my first lesson in playwriting. How to write something on the page without saying what I want to say, but yet intonating it. So the character became the same, except the gay character, I decided to make him a little more flamboyant and performative. So when the audience saw I'll be honest, I wasn't there for rehearsals because it was in the United States. From what King Sen told me, when the character slid onto stage, the audiences recognized and laughed at the character. And at some point, it clicked in that there was an understanding of what the character was, and it was human and 3-dimensional. At the end of the process, the whole play, people were empathizing with both characters. And from what I understand too, King Sen said that most of the people who saw the play were interested more about the disease and also volunteered for Action for AIDS that was started by Roy Khan. So to some extent, that was the whole nutshell of the experience.
What was the original title of the play called?
The original title of the play was 10 Little Indians because it was about the numbers, which I remembered from the public theater production of The Normal Heart. But then as I was writing the play, as we always do, I wondered what it was like if we had to live every day as if God listened. but he wasn't listening.
Yeah.
So that was the title in the end, As If He Hears. So.
Because I remember the original publicity called it Tendoliniums. Now, I just want to give you some context also. Now, that double bill was quite groundbreaking because Chay's piece followed the naturalist, the very realist paradigm, whereas Eleanor's piece was really quite satirical. So it exposed theatre, Singapore's audience to different forms of theatre that were at kind of like really big overseas at the moment, but also talked about those particular topics. And what was, to me, again, very, very groundbreaking was that at no point were the homosexual characters victimized. They were not the Kaposi sarcoma victims. It's actually the heterosexual characters, right? So Jackson and Sue's character, they were the ones, and that really made a very strong impact. And this was 88, 87, right? That was quite some time ago. And I think that opened up possibilities for other queer themed plays to be staged later. And I think that to me was quite a very positive and a difficult moment for Singapore theatre to recognize some kind of visibility for the LGBTQ. So then after that, I'm going to jump straight to a couple of years later. You wrote a play called Porcelain.
Yes.
Now, without going into the details of Porcelain, I just want to ask you that that play, I associate, kind of was very shocking for me because of the violence. It was very violent. It was emotionally, physically, and psychologically violent to the characters. I mean, there was abuse and there was a lot of that kind of thing that was happening here. And it was set in England. Mm-hmm. Okay, talk us through that. Why was it set in England? How did you come about writing it? And
it's always a preamble to everything I do.
Yes.
So basically, I was actually in Boston University studying for my film and TV master's. And I had to turn out a master's thesis. And one of them is to shoot a film. And when I was doing this awful class about religion, something, and the media, we were bored. So basically my friend and I would just look at the student newspaper and circle articles for each other to read. So the articles that came back to me frequently were the ones that were arrests made in school toilets. And I always said, so people do things there and they get arrested. So my thing is, being Singaporean, why would someone do that and get arrested? You know. Then I said to myself, what if I have no choice but to go there? So I created this whole piece about a young boy going into bathrooms and trying to find one's belonging and identity. And the original screenplay was actually a white character. And while I was in school, David Henry Hwang was touring with M. Butterfly and was giving a speech at Brandeis, and Kay Tong, an actor here in town, basically said you should go speak to David Hwang because he would love to hear from you, and he was a friend of Singapore theatre, including Theatre Works. Yeah. So I went to hear him talk, and then basically while hearing him talk, he basically said that sometimes why he writes what he does is because he feels the need to represent a community, his community, that has not been given visibility. And that stuck with me for a bit. And then another context of this was, I came home while I was at Boston University, and I went to see a show at the Drama Center, and this particular young man came to me and said, "You must be Chay Yew." And we had a little conversation, and he invited me to a party in his apartment. And then he talked to me a little bit, and he says, well, if and when you're ready, I want you to come to London and write something for me, and it will be in his little theatre company he started called Mulan Theatre Company in London. And to which I said, sure, why not? We'll just think about it. So when I graduated, I didn't have many plans. And I thought, well, why not go to London? So that young person is Glenn Gui, another... The Singapore connection is quite immense.
Indeed.
Globally.
Hence, I brought it up.
Right.
Yes.
So dear Glenn had me up in his top apartment where his infinite patience and generosity, I went out every night and danced to Kylie Minogue.
Well
Until
done.
all my money ran out. And I realized I had to write this play. And then I said, I have no idea, Glenn, I don't know. And Glenn's theatre company was focused on the Anglo-Chinese experience or Anglo-Asian experience in London. And I said, well, he said, what about this screenplay you wrote called Porcelain? And I said, oh, I don't know, because it's a film, there's so many locations. How much money do you have? And he says, not a lot. And to which, being the bitch that I was then and still am, and I said, have you done money for 5 chairs? And he says, yes. So I wrote the entire play to 5 chairs. And that became Porcelain. And because of those 5 chairs, it called for a Greek chorus, and also with my film background, and also with all the jagged narratives, it became this particular play. And I remembered, oh, these were awful days. And you're so lucky these days you have this thing called iCloud. Back then when we type something, and sometimes you go to sleep, and next thing you realize, the fucking computer didn't save the fucking script. And I freaked out, so I had to go retype the whole thing, which is actually, you learn things, right? So this is a gift of rewrites. And you realize the thing that you first wrote was actually not that important, except the things that you remembered. So that taught me what to do. And because I would go out clubbing and crawl back into Glenn's apartment, and I always had insomnia, so what I did was I started typing a play from experiences I had at the clubs. And the reason why it probably felt a little violent, I would just say it's actually not violent, it's emotionally violent. Yes. I agree. There's only one physically violent scene. The emotionally violent moments were probably the notion of racism, which is very interesting because I think, and I don't want to speak for the people here in the room who are not Chinese, I just think as a Chinese person in Singapore, you are basically the majority, and you don't really understand completely how the person who is not Chinese feel. You may think we're all equal, but we really aren't. Because there are a lot of subtleties of racism, subtleties of inequity that happens every moment of the day. Either small moments or big moments, and all the women in the room also understand what I mean when I say this. So basically, this was an interesting shift for someone who is able to run around Singapore like Julie Andrews to go to America to realize you're actually the maid. So that was very enlightening for me. So, and actually going to London was the worst experience because I don't care. I love you English people out there, but you have a lot of work to do. London in the 80s was worse than London in the 21st century. So it was very complicated and very difficult. And I remembered all the things that I experienced every time I went out, and then they manifested in the writing. And even though it's fictional, it's not true, the emotional truths were truthful. So to some extent, if I just basically wrote what I felt and what it really could be. So that was basically Porcelain.
And lucky for us, and I actually, a theatre company in Singapore called Toy Factory staged it in 2005, right? Starring a cast of heterosexual people, but that's a different conversation. So we're going to move on right now into, so I'm glad you brought in the race issue, because the third play that I want to talk about is my favorite of your plays. It's called A Language of Their Own. And that was something that addressed, I found it deeply moving, and it was in such it looked on paper extremely expositional, and it's expositional, there's storytelling, they're telling stories about each other, kind of across to each other, and it was so moving, and it talked about one of the issues that really surfaced and came into, I think it kind of started in Porcelain, but it came into the whole concept of self-loathing, and the whole idea of self-hatred for who you are, and not, the kind of issues like, oh, I'm not deserving of love. It's okay for me to be abused because I'm, that was really very, very powerful. And I want you to talk us through that piece, which of course was firstly directed by, again, King San, who directed your play in 87, and then back and again doing it for the public, right? So
the preamble for that was I sent Glenn Porcelain, which is a one-act play, 90 minutes. So, being old-fashioned, I thought, that play had no intermission. Oh my God, it's not enough. So I wrote him an act 2, and that was basically the first act of a language of their own. And Glenn, to his great wisdom, says you don't need it, and also because he's very, what's the right word? Impatient. And he one of his brilliant things is he's able to crystallize something and you say you don't really need it. So his editing powers are just tremendous. So I said, that's great. So I have this one act, I don't know what to do with it. So he says, go write a play with it. So when the reviews came out for Porcelain, I decided to use it. Back then, it was on the computer. Now I feel really old. I was a temp in the Hollywood studio, and what I would do is I would write letters using the stationery and the Xerox machine and everything, and would print scripts and mail them out to theaters in LA. And somehow Porcelain got done in LA, which is kind of great. And the big theater saw it, and they had a reading, and they thought, "Do you have a new play for us to read?" So it turned out that they wanted to read the play, and I said, "Well, I can't get out of work. You can do what you need to," because I didn't go to rehearsals at all. And they were doing a reading of it, and a 2-play reading, so 2 acts. The first was David Huang's Bondage, and the second act was my first act of language of their own called Learning Chinese. I say this with love. And David's play was already staged because it went to the Humana Festival. So when it came in, they were off book in costumes, and everything was like a little play. So here was I, the Singaporean guy, us, fuming in the corner.
Competitive.
I was like, what about me? And then when it came to my turn, they did the play, and then, all right, fine, whatever. They can read the play. And then they started laughing. And I died. They said, it's not supposed to be funny. And I was like, oh my, I got completely smaller and smaller as the play went on. And then finally it hit. That moment that I wanted it to hit emotionally, and it did. And I realized I'd written a comedy. And I didn't realize it was a comedy. And then the theater company came up to me and says, we're going to do this play. We want to do it, a small little theater company. And I says, yeah, but I need to write Act 2. So they let me write Act 2, which is basically broken English, and then ultimately became a language of their own. And then, before I come to the King's Head part, my agent at the time sent it all out, Porcelain out to people, and they all said, oh, it's a really good play, but we can never do it. Because it's risque, and small theaters would do it. Actually, it's my most produced play, but never in a major theater. And a young woman from Lincoln Center called up and said, I love your work, let me know what you're writing. And then next time she was at the public theater, she called up and she said, listen, do you have anything for us to look at? And I said, yeah, I've got this play. They read it, they liked it, and they decided to read it with a public reading, and they got us there. And then in this festival, the artistic director was George C. Wolfe, wonderful black director, did amazing work. She said, he may not show up in Act 2 because he has to go downstairs to open the show, so don't worry about it. I said, no worries. And I was young, just happy to be there and being silly and everything. And it was important for me because that was the same theater that did a language, that did Normal Heart. And for me, even with Glenn's production that moved to the Royal Court, when I was there, the play that influenced me was Death and the Maiden. So these 2 theaters were significant to me when I was younger. So it was 10 years after Normal Heart, they did this reading. And then they held the house for 15, 20 minutes. I was freaking out. What's going on? George wants to come back and see Act 2. So he saw Act 2. 3 months later, he called and he said, we're going to do the play. And then, of course, at the United States at the time, and still is in a way, trying to make sure that everyone has some sense of equity, even though they stumble all the time also. Look at the new president. So, So they stumbled and basically said, we need an Asian director. Who do you recommend in America? So they asked me to meet with John Lone, and I said, well, he's an actor. And they gave me someone else, well, he's a set designer. Then I said, well, I have a friend who's doing his master's program, who's a director called King Sen. And then they were kind of wary of King Sen because they didn't know what King Sen did. And, I understand because having run a theater, sometimes you want to see the director's work. So they decided to audition King Sen by having him work on the play. And King Sen, of course, was fuming, rightly so, because I would have fumed too. Who auditions a director, right? So I said, but your tongue be Chinese. We win in the end. the long haul, right? So they saw how he worked, and in the end they said, "Great, we'll have Kingston come on board." So in 1995, the play went up, and Kingston directed, and I just remember saying, "Wow, two Singaporeans in front of the public theater. This is exciting." And then after that, we went out on different paths. So that was the genesis of A Language of Time.
And I just want to go back to it and talk about the characters. And again, all three plays that I've talked about had characters dealing with HIV.
Yeah.
But in very different ways. I think as the plays grew from As If all the way to the idea of approaching death is not so difficult, but it's almost the struggle of worthiness, right? The characters that were there, and what was interesting for those of you who are not familiar with Language of Their Own, 3 Asian characters and 1 Caucasian character. And what like is not the right word. What I thought was very intriguing is Chay managed to twist the narrative around, because our old conception is that, the cool white man, right, will always be dominating over, but in that, the kind of emotional abuse was actually from the Asian character to the Caucasian character. That flip was very, very, very interesting. Not that I condone violence of any sort, but dramaturgically, that was very, very interesting for the time, because you've never seen that. It's like Madame Butterfly got twisted around in terms of that. And then you created Ming. I have to say, is one of the most unsympathetic characters ever. Terrible, terrible character. But then in the end, you connected with Ming. You just said, yeah, okay, fine. You do whatever that you want there. Because then they became more than mouthpieces for causes, right? So just go in a little bit more about how you created these characters.
Well, I would just say that I'm not sure self-hatred is the big thing, but I'm sure there is definitely a tone, particularly in the main character. So basically, it was very interesting was the fact that I thought, I've never seen an Asian couple on stage, a gay couple, and I thought I wrote to that. So one was basically someone who is a bit of an immigrant, and the other one's very Asian American, and yet there was the opposites were wonderful, and yet it was the thing that tore them apart, and there was an age dynamic too. So when I think the younger person, Ming, try to figure himself out by wanting to see other people, it begins with that. I think we should see other people. I think so. And that created a rift, and then the older person feeling, well, I think I can. Now it's polyamory, right? It's like, who knew I was ahead of my time? So basically, he allowed that relation to occur until Oscar became HIV positive, and we don't know how he got it. So Ming felt bad, and yet he tried to live with it, but he couldn't, and then the whole relationship broke apart. It's also about the attraction, which it was interesting because I think I never thought of it. I think it was my experience watching my friends who are Asian couples, and sometimes I remember this one thing. It's so easy to date other Asian people because when we want to eat rice, we eat rice. That was something that I never thought of. I was like, wow, so there are more connections than not. So I was interested in exploring that relationship. So once that relationship broke up, because Ming was so American, I just wondered what it was like to have that relationship with a white person. Not to say that the relations of that kind don't work out. They do work out. But I think because Ming was he couldn't find his place, either in the Asian part of him, or the American part of him, or even the gay part of him, or whatever part of it. And through that, it was violent, and also seeking. And it was actually self-destructive, and definitely came from a sense of not knowing oneself, and also what love is. So in the end, the whole thing, in the end, the whole play rests on what is love. And I think maybe I'm not a nice person too, because there's some moments in Act 2 I just wanted to punish. I think life is just not pretty sometimes. I remember one moment where I wanted, Oscar was dying, and basically to his Filipino boyfriend, who was there for him all the time. And the last thing that in his dementia, he calls out for Ming instead of him. So he wasn't quite sure. So there was all these layers, Because I think love is not clean. I think we all want the great love story,
Messy, yeah.
but it's messy, and I think you just have to be, I think it's the reason why all plays are written, because we still don't understand what is hate and what is love, and what is desire and what is ambition. So these are the major big themes which we constantly try to interrogate, and it changes every time as humanity moves forward in time. So for that, I just want to figure out what it really meant. And in the end, it's how we either settle or we don't, or we just say we love each other very differently, and we just have to accept that. So the whole play was all about that language.
Yeah.
We share different languages.
And again, language, if you have a chance to read it, I really would encourage you to. That play literally sings. It has this beautiful rhythm of the lines, the use of repetition, the use of just rhythm is beautiful. And Singapore was very lucky to have watched the play both in English and in Mandarin. So it got translated into Mandarin, and director of both is here today. His name is Casey Lim. And again, what I found quite interesting is in 2012, when it got translated into Mandarin and was performed at the Singapore Arts Festival at the time, Casey made a deliberate decision not to have any English subtitles. And there were many, many audience members in there that didn't understand Mandarin. But apparently, so I did a bit of a sample. Would it bother you? So they didn't bother at all, because they just heard whatever that's happening and found the way that it was so effective in that sense. So it really is a masterpiece, and I would encourage you to read it. So just to finish off the segment as a playwright, just kind of like, sorry to be so hackneyed about it, but advice to playwrights. I mean, you went, it almost feels as though you were a playwright of circumstance, of need, or suddenly like, did you track your career, when I'm 22, I'm going to write this play, 22. It didn't, it almost like, oh God, I have to write plays, do it. But you always had these ideas, and you can see, if you track through these plays, you can see a thread, a very clear thread.
You can, because you're on the outside.
Yes.
I think when we're living our lives, when we see a door, we open it. So to some extent, for all the artists and the people, human beings in the room, when there's a door, just walk through it. You just don't know what's in the room. If you don't like it, you can leave. If you like it, stay for a while, then you begin to see there's another door. And I think I've always seen it and likened it to a series of rooms in which the artistic life has always been. And sometimes I just want you to know, just because the door opens doesn't mean that you're worthy enough to walk through that door too. And I'm not one of those tipping point people that say things like, but I do believe that when you walk through something, the opportunity that arises, you have to match the opportunity with what your experience and your skill might have been, so that when you walk through it, it's going to be a new landscape. So sometimes I've been guilty of that. When an opportunity opens, I just walk through it because someone just presented me with a tiara. I'm going to wear it. Then you realize I wasn't ready. And it's fine. You make those mistakes and you learn. But all I'm saying to you, everyone here, is if you want to be writing a play, don't worry about a career. There's no such thing. It's a life. I mean, I don't call it sentimentally. Yes, it chooses you, and you are going to jump into it. And for Singaporeans, I'm so sorry. The problem with Singaporeans is that, sometimes we are so pragmatic about everything. If you start thinking pragmatically, you'll never become an artist. Because it doesn't really, because I think most pragmatic people want to know what is happening with Act 1 to Act 2 to Act 3. So you plan everything like an accounting sheet, right? It has to balance. But I want to tell you this. Do you know what's going to happen to your life 5 minutes from now? Will you be hit by a bus? Will you fall in love? You don't know. So in a wonderful way, that's what the life of an artist is. And the only thing is, if you're an artist in Singapore, the question then becomes this: are you the poet of the community? Because these people that we are surrounded by don't have your talents and your gifts. They cannot speak. They cannot act. So if you're telling their stories, they've given you a gift. So are you using it to do that? And how are you being honest in portraying that person? So when they see themselves on stage, they are heard, they are visible. And then to some extent, it doesn't always need to be that representation too. One big thing too is that we grapple with stories is, why do we need stories? We need it because it's the oldest thing in the world. Is language. Someone did say this. I'm going on a tangent, but I'm going to anyway. So, someone said, "How was language created, and how are stories created?" Well, they actually believed at some point it's gossip. That you see what he killed. That's the mundane, and then at some point it became the heroic, because those stories. The reason why we gravitate to these kinds of stories in the theater or in literature is because it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The notion of the capability that you do not know that you might possess, that you have come to this crossroads that demands a choice that you make, right or wrong, you're going to do it. That makes it exciting and also makes it memorable. That's why there's some stories that you hear, when you leave the theater particularly, after you applaud and you say, "What do you want to eat?" The show's in trouble. But if it sits and grabs at your heart, hopefully it changes the way you look at the person next to you when you're on the MRT or when you go to the booth to vote. Something has changed. So what is the story that you're trying to tell? That becomes really significant. So to all of you out there, I would just say, write what you love. Also know that it is not a walk in the park. There's a responsibility. The responsibility is, what are you trying then to encapsulate, to tell the stories of the country that you live in? And how do you make sure that the extraordinary things that extraordinary people do are being remembered? Because that's the problem ultimately in this country too, I would just say. Is that everything shifts so quickly. We don't really have. We need more stories than you think, for us to feel Singaporean. I may be wrong, and forgive me, because I come in and out of this country, so I may be saying the wrong thing, and I deserve to say the wrong thing. So it's always been a seeking of what is this national song that we have, national costume, the national whatever. That's really fucked up, because you're not looking hard enough. It's already there. And it may not be one, which is so wonderful. It could be a few things. So the thing is that if you're out there telling stories, then what are these stories that represent the emblematic, wonderful thing called Singapore, which is actually not one thing, but many things. So you need to tell more stories, different kinds of stories, and not to one group of people too. And we are all guilty of it globally, because the stories that we tell on theater sometimes is class-based. That means who can afford the theater ticket? If those people can't afford the theater ticket, are they discounted? Are they excluded? Are their stories not worthy? Are they not Singaporeans? Then you're in deep shit. That means that Singaporean theater is only to the elite. And you know what happened to the United States? I'm just saying that there's a lot of conversations that need to be had in this community about how to tell more different kinds of stories, different aesthetics, and including different things. And I know we're doing it here in Singapore. I want to encourage you to do more. As you write, think of it in that way. Who's not being seen on stage? And I'm sitting here only to tell you that sometimes I don't, of all the Asians who are in America, they can tell the same story. I never see myself on stage. And then when they see that one character, and probably Glenn will be the one that says, if he came down, even in a dress, the Asians are like, "Oh my God," and butterfly. I see me. That moment is visibility. It empowers the next generation to actually have voice. And also, not only a voice in the arts, but a voice as a citizen. So this art thing that we do sounds like it's arts and crafts. It's not. It's a calling. And sometimes you're not going to get paid. It's hard, but I think that's what you're meant to do. So you write boldly and bravely. And also, my one note for you is try and write beyond Singapore too. If this play that you write for Singapore can live in Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, There's something wonderful about this. But if it lives and dies in Singapore, it's not a bad thing too. I'm just saying there's a lot where you come from. I think we had this conversation before.
Yeah.
Also, one last thing, I'll move on. There's lots of things I can say, but I think it's important to understand the legacy in which you have been given. And that is the generations of Singapore playwriting that came before you. If you have not seen these plays, you're kind of screwed. If you've not read them, you're kind of screwed. You know why? Because you think what you are writing is actually new, but someone has written it 30 years ago. So the wheel has not been reinvented.
Correct.
So that also means theatre companies need to bring back some of these plays so that we have a relationship to what's been written 30 years ago. For example, maybe the West does it frequently because sometimes it's commercial too. Let's bring back Death of a Salesman. Let's bring back Gypsy. To some extent, then you begin to see what was written in the 50s, what was written in the 80s, and what are you going to be writing in the future. And also the diversity of it too. Not only, English-speaking Chinese plays, but what about the Tamil plays? What about the Malay plays? Because there are all these things that we have, the wealth that has not been really mined. I say this to Americans, and I'll say this to you too. You're not really Singaporean until you understand that you have to know the Malay history, the Indian history, even the Western history that is part of this country, because that's the reason why we're so diverse. It can't be one narrative. If there's only one narrative, you're not a Singaporean theatre company. You're just a Chinese elite theatre company or an English-speaking theatre company. You're just not representing everything. Language is a whole different conversation, of course. I'm just saying, what are these other stories that we need to tell? So it's actually tremendous and actually exciting and challenging. You need that challenge. If it's simple and you get it done, there's nothing left to do the next day. So I hope this is going to be a lifetime of grappling, evolving, so that you can bring... I just know that everyone has come before me and you. Really want all the young people here in this room, the next generation, to do better than all of us, because you have more opportunities than we have ever done so, and you cannot squander it. You have to write brilliantly. Write about your generation and your ideas. If you do not let us know what you feel in terms of your generation, then you'll be silent. And silence is a response. And if you do not write what you know about your people and your generation and your community, someone else is going to write it for you. And when someone else writes a narrative about you, they will vote, they will think, they will destroy you the way they think that someone else has written you. Good luck.
It's just a bit of it resonates with me and with Casey and with Jensen and with one of the Center 42 co-founders, Michelle, and which is why we got together and formed Center 42. Because Singapore theatre history is a series of discontinuities. I encourage everybody, if you are running out of ideas to write a play, go read all the old plays that have been in the 80s, 90s. Have a good laugh, because some of them are quite laughable. But you kind of got to also know where you are and what you can do. And you kind of suddenly realize, I'm part of a tribe. I'm part of a community. I don't write on myself. Right? So the whole level of history, it's very, very important. So then you don't kind of make really laughable claims that, oh, this is a revolutionary way of doing it. I had students coming up to me and say, oh, I should have written something I think it's never been done in Singapore before. I said, go read this play by somebody called Adelyn Tan that was written in 1993, right? Just go read it. And then they were shocked. And then they feel defeated because, oh, I'm not original, I don't write anymore. No, that should not be the case. Yeah. So again, I want to thank Chay for bringing that out, because we need to connect. Right? We need to connect with our past. We need to connect with the present. Right? Because we can't just connect with the present and write about things that matter to me. We also need to contextualize and position ourselves. So I'm going to move on to what, prior to this meeting, we either, Casey and myself had a chat with Chay, and he had a very interesting way of describing why he likes directing. He says, I like directing because directing is playwriting in 3D.
Oh yeah.
And I said, what do you mean? I said, yeah, my approach as a director, because I'm a playwright, is very dramaturgical, right? So I wanted you to kind of talk us through your shift. It's not that you've stopped playwriting, but you're now moving on to directing. So what is directing in 3D and what is your dramaturgical approach to directing?
Contextually.
Yes.
So after Language of Their Own opened, a theater company in Los Angeles called Center Theater Group came to me with a Mellon Foundation grant. Says, "Come join us. We're going to make you a resident artist." And I say, "For what?" So that I'm a token on your staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a mouth. So it says, no, you can do anything you want. So I thought about it and said, well, you have a Latino lab, you have a Black lab, and a disability lab. I'm going to start an Asian American lab. Would you let me do it? And they said yes, and they gave me money. So what I did was I started commissioning writers to write work and developing not only LA-based Asian theater artists, but also national artists. And because of that, at some point we have readings. And one day we ran out of directors, and someone says, why don't you direct? And that became like crack, right? It's like, wow. I never knew this dress fit so well. It's like, where's the ball? So basically, maybe it's something that I've always wanted to do. I don't know, but I just felt the wonderful thing about theater is you don't have to stay in your lane, but once you've done enough of one, I will also suggest don't do everything at the same time, because you will never begin to learn how to, forgive me with this awful word, master the form, but you have to know what you're working on before you do the next thing. Yeah. So and I think to some extent for me too, Asian directors were rare to begin with at the time in the 90s. And so I never got a chance to do any classical work. They will never look at me for any classical. I think up to the last maybe 10 years ago, I only had done 2 or 3 Western work that was given to me. And even though some of them had to be adapted by myself so that I can actually do it. So where my lane was new work. So that became a superpower too, because it's one of those things where, because I was a playwright, I was able to understand how the structure of the play could work. And not to also use it as a stencil, but to understand that my superpower, I always tell other directors that they can't do is, because in some strange way, most playwrights trust me, because it feels like I've gone through what they've gone through as a playwright, so I can give a prescriptive note that directors can't. So for directors, they have to find a different way to give a dramaturgical note. So because of that, I did a lot more work did a lot of new work, basically. And directing in 3D, which is basically kind of wonderful too, because I would say like, that's something I want to work on. But then this playwright came to me and said, I'm working on the same subject too, and look at it. And I said, that's a much better play than mine in my head. Why don't we just work on it together? So there was an opportunity for me to actually learn. And up to today, I'm still doing it because I'm going back to work on 8 projects, which are in development. And they are all younger writers. They have kept me alive, and they have kept me questioning, and they've kept me figuring out new things, because younger people have different ways of looking at the world, and yet sometimes the context that they have for me is my experience and what I've had done before. So the collaboration has always been kind of great. So collaborating in 3D, not complicated, and I've come a very different way of directing it too, because I was one of the few playwrights that would sit intact because I'm curious. So the director, like Kingston, would say, go sit with the lighting designer. Don't talk to me. So I would sit next to the lighting designer and learn how they started doing things, which is the wrong way to begin with. So I always preface with my lighting designer, even like in today's Zoom, I said, so listen, we're working together, but I just want you to know that the way that I direct is very technical. So if I say that light is going up to 30 with a count of 4 going up, crossfade to 5 with this boom and this, so some people get touchy, but some people don't. So I'm just saying that you can learn all these things because the theater gives you a full life. So as a result of this, by my dramaturgy, I'm always asked to do a lot of new plays. So that's been exciting in and of itself.
What is it like being an artistic director of a theater company in the United States?
And because I sat in a lot of panels, like some of these, saying shit about everything, because the world should be the way that I think it should be. So they call my bluff, and they said, why didn't you run a theater? And I said, no, I don't know. Why don't you run a theater? So finally I said, sure, why not? Because I realized at the time, American theaters are very different from European theaters and Asian theaters. Well, not really Asian theaters. I think because most European theaters, artistic directors say 5 to 10 years, and then they leave. It's very interesting, and I kind of love it too because they'll bring an enfant terrible, 23 years old, and then they'll see the world in a very different way. So for 5 years, the National Theatre of Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic or something, you'll see radical things from a generation of artists. In the United States, it's more career-based because we do not have, as Singapore doesn't, and it's a shame and a sin, public government funding of artists and arts institutions. So as a result of that, people who stay in those roles, particularly in the United States, is a career. So they stay there for 40 years. So when the time I was there, no one has left their positions. They've been there for 30 to 50 years. These are lifers. The problem with that sometimes too is not to say that all of them are terrible. It's just that what happens is that you forget your peers. No, you remember your peers, but you forget there are 3 generations of artists that you're not basically attuned to. And that's bad for the theater and bad for the field in general. So when the opportunity came to run the theater, they said, do it. And I said, sure. I was one of the few new artistic directors in the country and also a artistic director of color. So what was tricky too was this theater company in question was run by a founder artistic director, and there was a little rule in American theater. The second person that takes over the job of the founder artistic director usually fails. No, well, because, happened in the public theater, happened in a lot of theaters. So I somewhat freaked out, but the good thing was that I had run the lab, and also full circle, my father's wisdom, learn management, which is basically yell at people and make them do what you want. So to some extent, that helped, but then one thing kept me alive. I cannot fail. If I fail, the next person of color will not be allowed to run the theater again. So that is very negative, but negative things sometimes can be made positive if you use it for the right purposes. So that kept me alive and always pushing the boundaries for 9 years at Victory Gardens Theater in Chicago.
Did you, apart from, you brought up artistic director of color, was there any kind of pushback against that, or did you have problems securing funding?
No, because can be recording it. When you are not a majority and you realize there are cards to be played, I call it the race card. I have a stack of them. I'll use it when I need to use them.
Okay.
So the thing is that I can say, I'm doing this. Guess what? It's a person of color. You need to do this because everything that you're doing is not. And I'm a person of color running a theater. Don't you think I need funding and support? So you find ways until they realize you're capable enough. Then they start funding you in a very different way. I'm just saying that, and I'm sure Ivan over there is probably in agreement with me. We love the artists so much that we will do anything to make sure the work is on stage, and also that the people that come to the theater can see themselves. So I don't care how we get that money. We're getting the goddamn money because the play has to be put up. Even though it didn't quite work, it was for an artist to actually figure out that play so that the next play they write on is the better one. Kurosawa, the famous Japanese director, said Ran was the culmination of the last 4 samurai films that he did, because those samurai films he did were rehearsals for Ran. So to some extent, it's not about, again, Singaporeans, don't think of it as product. Think of it as a journey, So when you get there, I hope you don't know you've arrived. I just hope by that time when you die, this is the legacy you leave to people. So what is this journey you're on that you keep stopping in wonderful places? So just to encapsulate the experience is, I think artistic directorship was something that I had to do because it was something that I had to give back for something that had given me, especially for someone whom I always felt coming to the United States. The only community I had was the Asian Theater Company and the theaters and all the artists who actually welcomed me to this family. I think without that, I would feel probably a little more alienated in this country, in that country. But because of that, my question is, when I was running the theater, what did I get that I could replicate, and what didn't I get that I should give back so that the model shifts. And when that model is done, I have a rule too, because my friends always say, don't stay more than 10 years. Stay for 10 years, and if you feel there's another challenge for the next 5, then stay for the 5. So I had done basically what I set out to do for 10 years. On my 9th year, it was just time to go. Then COVID happened. See, things happen.
Would you do it again? Would somebody offer you artistic directorship? Is that something you want to do?
There have
now?
been some courtships, but I don't have plans unless it's something that is interesting. Then I may say yes. I just think it's the way that I have conducted my artistic life is, like I said to you, I'm not lying to you. It's just doors and rooms. If I feel like staying in that room, I'm going to go through it, and there are 3 doors. I'll take one. If I don't like it, I'll just leave. But meanwhile, where I am is exciting, and I like it. I just want to also say that it's not always easy. It hasn't still been easy because as you get older, especially in the United States, and I'm sure the same thing here, is that you have the lifestyle in which you're going to have as a theater artist is not going to be the same one as the bankers. And I'm going to count the wealth that you're going to have compared to a bankers. May I be so bold to say that you're probably going to have a lot more wealth than they are going to be having wealth because of what you are creating, the community and the people in which you're reaching, and the generations of younger people that are enlightened. And the stories that you tell is just wealth in and of itself. And the stories that you tell and the countless of characters and circumstances that you can actually embody and humanize, those are the gifts. So that all to say is it will be difficult. It continues to be difficult. I'm only fortunate because I've been working, and there will be a moment when I'm sure, as life would say, there'll be less to do. Then the question also becomes, in this country you're luckier too because you have CPF. In the United States, more complicated. And then health insurance, very, very complicated because you pay for the health insurance and you realize most of my friends during COVID, Tony Award-winning actors and artists and nominated artists have to give up their apartments because they cannot afford to pay for them because there was no work. So in that country, we still want to do it because we believe in the value of this. So for all of you here, you have chosen something wonderful, and guess what? It's not easy, and you will be fine. Find the joy in creating the things that you create. And you only can tell the wealth of that is when some young person in the audience has changed. And you will look hard enough to see what this young person looks like, and you'll realize that it's a version of yourself when you first saw that wonderful thing on stage. And that person is going to do something else. So it's a special thing that you're all involved in. Please keep doing it.
Now I'm going to open to the audience for any questions you'd like to ask Chay.
You can ask anything.
He has given me permission to ask him anything. So please.
I just want this moment to be helpful to you on your journey. So, I mean, unless you want to ask me who I hate, I can tell you. But I have a big book, so, it's going to take all day.
We invite any questions. Just let us know who you are. Yes, please, Joe.
Hi, Chay. We've not actually met, but we can Chay.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. I'm really curious to hear about your point of view as an artistic director making programming decisions of new writing. How do you balance risk? How do you deal with risk? Right? Like you said earlier, it doesn't always work out. And the long game is about how maybe it's about a writer's development.
Yeah.
How that needs to get better. But then there's all these commercial pressures, right? And margins that need to be met. So how do you reckon with risk in your writing development?
I would say that as an artistic director, I'm beholden to one thing and that's the mission of the theater company. Everything I do, my staff does, and everything is on stage and off has to point towards the mission of the theater. If anything that's outside of the mission of the theater, I cannot do it. And there are a lot of theaters who will pick up the slack. The mission of the theater is basically to do new work and work that basically, and I shifted it because as an artistic director, that basically reflects the city of Chicago, because I wanted Chicago to have that. So when I was in Chicago, I realized what we had were great actors, the best. Steppenwolf, John Malkovich's, they all come from Chicago. Even Tina Fey, right? All the comic actors. What we had a deficit in sometimes is playwrights. So in a city of 250 theaters, there's not a lot of playwrights. So technically, it's a playwright's wet dream come true. Because if you do one play, I told you about that. I told you, you do one play, when the theaters see it, they want you for the next few plays. So to some extent, that is the ecology. And one thing I've learned while running a theater too is dramaturgical. I realized that I don't know the city well enough. I need some dramaturgy. So reading history books and social books about the history of Chicago, now I understood what racial segregation meant in this city, what all these histories mean. So once you figure those things out, then you say to yourself, now how does your theater embody the work that is going to come out to reflect not only the mission but the cities and its history? So when I said, well, we need to create a new black play for the community, how do we do that? And some playwrights sometimes don't really want to do it. You go find the right writers. I had two good friends, black writer Marcus Gardley, who actually wrote the Color Purple musical, the film, and Luis Alfaro, who is also a MacArthur genius writer. But both of them function within the community. So they go into the community, speak to the people, make them participate, and then to some extent through our programming, we find ways to bring the show to the community and also the audience to our theater. So because of that fine line is very simple. What I also learned in Chicago is that in my first interview, someone asked me, what kind of plays do I gravitate towards as an artistic director? And I said, I hate realism. Oh my God, the phone calls I got, because it's Chicago, because they're all into realism, and it's not a real play till someone grabs a chair and throws it across the back, which I did my first show because it was an homage to Chicago. So you realize at some point, you cannot come in with a colonial mindset to tell them this is what I think theater is. You have to understand, looking into Chicago, these are the things in which they understand, in which stories come from, and now how do I coincide that relationship between me as an artistic director and the city in and of itself of Chicago, and how do we keep going backwards and forwards? I'm not going to feed them all the time, because I don't think my theater is commercial, because we're nonprofit. So because of that, the big thing was diversity too, which was tricky because when I did that, people were laughing. We'll see how far you go with that little Asian artistic director. I know my friends were all stepping back. So when the first show I did, being recorded, I decided to replace the show for some reason and said, you know what, we're going to put this show in because I think it's important. It's a hip-hop show, 2 Puerto Ricans and 2 African Americans. It's about Hurricane Katrina. During previews, an audience member came out to my front of house staff who's black and said, oh my God, there are N people on stage. N people are using the word N. That means I can too. Next thing you know, N people are doing Shakespeare. To which I had to say, we will be doing more of these plays. Here's the refund of the registered subscription. I checked in with my front of house guy, and he was very upset. And God bless him, through my mentorship of this young individual, he became part of my artistic staff. He left my theater, became a director, and about 5 years ago, did the first Black Hamlet on stage that won all the awards. The thing is, something I've learned a long time ago, maybe as an ACS schoolboy, they're gonna throw shit at you.
Yeah.
You stand. You keep standing because they will get tired. And then next thing you know, they'll ask you to come sit at your table. But then you can decide whether you want to sit at the table or not. But the thing is, you have to stand and fight and get this thing going. So this diversity thing at some point became a thing. So every theater says, we're going to do it, because that show that I did, turns out that I lost 50% of my audiences. Sometimes, you just have to bloodlet. But then the young people coming back to some people come to the theater, bringing their parents, and those who wanted to stay, stayed. So it took about 5 years called the churn rate, which is basically those who left and then they came back. That churn rate was the highest in the country. So to some extent, we had built our audience back. And because the theater became, I would say to some extent, a place where they began to see themselves. So I was taught this to, remember artistic directors, people, I want to talk about that a little bit too, which is basically, sometimes you're not alone, but always ask favors and questions of your colleagues. And one of my friends told me this, who is an artistic director, you're going to give them something and you're going to take something. So I gave him a realism play, but the realism has to be based in the community. And I'll give them something with this Lucas Nath play, very esoteric play. So it's a push and a give. And then at some point, the audiences, which I really wanted, was value for this place. So they'll say, I do not always like what you do, but I know when I come here, I know what I'm getting. That's what I really wanted. So I think the long game is stick to the mission of the theater. And new writing is difficult for Chicago too, because Chicago never did new work. They always would do, we're doing Miss Julie again. How many times did you do Miss Julie? Huh? We did last year. Because the actors, is an actor town. They love doing these plays. So when you do a new play, which is true, you can market Miss Julie because everyone knows Miss Julie, right? But you say it's Mr. Julie, it's like, what the hell is that? How much money are you going to pay for that? So that became very difficult, but we had to come up with different ways of marketing and figuring out how to bring the people in. So sometimes the community works. So once you develop a community, they would just say, you know what? I don't know what it is, but the value is I want to come and experience it. So all these plays that we did, in the end, a lot of new work happened. And it's also through a lot of programming ways which I think Wallrise does too. We're going to do a classic play, but then you kind of know it or you don't know it, but then we'll do a local slant to it. So it also becomes a new play, while I would just say a nod to the classic. So there are many ways of doing these things. I mean, I will just say this country needs passionate producers. It's not enough that all of you sitting here wants to direct, wants to act, and wants to write. Because without a producer, all these things that you want to do will not happen. So I just hope that some people out here are going to try to figure out a way to mentor young people, and you young people, producing is not boring. It's like directing a play for as long as you are in the office. So to some extent, if you can see the play that you direct, each season, the people that you have, the audience that you have, you're building something. So the storytelling is immense. I just hope there will be a new generation of adventurous, passionate producers in Singapore, because without you, I would be a little concerned for the field here. It's the same thing in the United States as well, because it's actually more fun to create, but do not be fooled. The producer is just as creative. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Any other questions for Chay? Yes, please, at the back.
Hi, I'm Theo. I've always loved your work, and I'm just curious. I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit more about your decision to leave Singapore, your decision to make a life and work abroad, and perhaps how that came about and how that's developed and evolved in your time abroad.
Sure. I will just say, my journey is never the same as anyone's, because that was back in the 80s when I was 3, like I said. So the thing was that it was harder, and there was very few opportunities, and because I wanted to run, and the field here was walking in a different clip than I was wanting to run, so I just made the choice to leave. Also, I didn't realize there was actually the theater thing I was pursuing, because I thought I was going back to do more film and TV. See, I just don't know what's in front of me till I realize there's a fork in the road I chose. I think if that question is for you, you have to say to yourself, will you have enough opportunity to go abroad to do what you need to do? I will just say that there are pluses and minuses in everything that we do, right? I think when we work overseas, you're dealing with a lot of things that are going to be very not hard, but things that you have to grapple with. I also want to say that there's a bunch of wonderful Singaporean theater artists they're in the United States. Some of them are colleagues who are directors and actors and designers, and I'm very proud to have worked with them in many different kinds of capacities. Their lives are just as hard because if you want to do something really badly in a different place, you just do it. Don't overthink it. If you want to, go. And if you don't like it, come back. No one's going to judge you. But don't be that person when you're a certain age and say, I wish I could have done something, but I didn't do it. There's no regrets. There's just no time for regrets. And if you go to that place and you realize you find your footing, do more. And you also don't know, right? And countries change. Look at the United States now, right? I don't know what's happening, but I just know that something is happening. At some point, we will continue to tell those stories because as long as there's a fire,
In California right now.
I mean a fire that we start,
Yeah.
that someone's going to get up to tell a story, and that person is going to be you. So if you feel that's the right place to go, do it. And also when you come back, and there are wonderful artists in this room too who have done the same thing, that the contact and the experience they've had overseas also enriches the work that you can do here and the community in Singapore. Or if you don't even need that, but also finding a way to understand how you can actually invest in the local theater community here and make it global, make it regional. How do you create that kind of work that can be seen in all the ASEAN countries? I mean, I'm kind of surprised all the ASEAN countries haven't figured out how to, I know it's language and a couple of things, but how do we get our plays to different cities so that the plays that we write in Singapore doesn't live and die in one theater or in one country? There must be other ways. Is it translation? Is it partnerships? Again, we need imaginative, passionate producers to figure these things out so that then you have more opportunities. I mean, I'm not going to call him out, but I think Alfian went to Vietnam. It's so exciting to see him in December collaborating with other people, creating a historical work. That's the kind of adventures I want that for you, because it's not only within Singapore, it's also regional. And then from regional, with Singapore Arts Festival, I hope, there are more international opportunities to collide and to learn new things from other artists, so that you're not isolated within one region or one country, but you become a global artist. But again, it reverberates. But these things are not going to be handed to you. You just have to rattle those cages. And if Singapore really believes that art is important, you have to help them articulate it. And sometimes they don't know. And it's not their fault. It's just sometimes we have done a bad job of not articulating it well enough. And sometimes there's a way to create that moment for Singapore to understand the investment in artists also means the financial investment of this country. Because it's really true, for people to come overseas to work in this country, the reason it's kind of sad if they have to go every weekend to Bali. That means it's not enough to sustain them here. So that means, to some extent, if you're trying to encourage foreign workers and intelligentsia to this country, there is a book by Rick Moody who basically says, if you have a city that has a vibrant artistic life, great talent will come. So that is one thing that Singapore government needs to invest in. And also to find a way to make sure that the grants they give you is less of the things that you have to take off to do, which I understand were things like you have to have a couple of exhibitions, you have to teach, because I think it's become transactional. It's not only in the Singapore, also United States. They think that to give you that money, you have to do all these things. So how can you educate the status quo about what value there is to art? And sometimes it's the people, right? Are you doing art and bringing it to the housing estate? Because they don't go to the theater. And you know those void decks? The kind of theaters. Now, I don't know what the law is about performing, because I'm sure there's a lot of laws. But that doesn't mean that you can't be inventive. You've invented to write a goddamn play. You should be inventive to figure out how to talk to the government about getting you some space in the void deck. And what is that story? And what are plays that you can do that is interactive, that are immersive, that takes you around the estate? I don't know. But more of these people getting their stories being heard and also excited about that, is also going to come out in votes and pressure, and then the government's going to see the value of art being the unity of its people. So I don't think we've completely understood the power that we have in the performing arts yet. I know I'm simplifying this, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's more possibility to which I'm speaking of here than even trying to reinvent the wheel in the United States. Because that's a whole different model altogether. So go do your thing. Your life is short.
We have another question there.
Hi.
Chay Yew, my name is Steph. Could you talk a bit about your work with Christina Wong,
Oh.
Sweatshop Overlord, and thoughts on directing solo work?
Okay. Context. I think I've directed 20 solo works. Why? Because it was when I started, there's not a lot of things to be done. And solo work was the best kind of political work because it doesn't require two people in the audience. All it does is two people in the audience and one person, and there's no fourth wall. So we're speaking. And that was very theatrical for me, and I was also speaking and learning from a lot of wonderful young people who were doing solo work. Christina Wong is an old friend of mine because when I started at CTG, that little lab that I was cultivating a lot of solo performers, and she was just very young at the time. So when a theater company in New York Theater Workshop, called me up and said, "What do you think of Christina Wong?" I said, "I love her. She has this piece that she's been doing over the pandemic on the Zoom thing, which is interesting because the context of this piece is inspiring, I have to say, because she and I have this like bitchy relationship all the time. The point of the piece was this, and it's her life, is she was performing in colleges because there's only so much you can do, and then one day the pandemic came and she realized she was a non-essential worker, right? So she said, "Oh my God, how do I make myself essential? I know. I'll scroll and find out. The world needs masks. I'll sew masks." So God bless her, she started sewing masks, the fabric ones, right, back then, to certain people. And then all of a sudden, people start finding out that she sews masks. And because the American government, is not capable of supplying masks, she's inundated with calls. 5 workers need them. And then she starts freaking out. And then she realized, I need to create a network. So she called her community Asian aunties who are stuck at home with sewing machines, right? Come sew for me. So she created a national network of Asian women, and then it grew to the LGBTQ community, to women of color, to white women. Everyone was sewing. And then they sent masks out to Alaska where they needed it. I don't know whether you've seen this, but we had this map of Alaska, which is very big. And this state, it only has 1 hospital and no masks. So she had to buy, I think, a car or something so that she became a network. All this to say is one thing. It takes one artist to do something the American government cannot do, to supply masks to the people. What is the lesson here? You people can do a play if I gave you $5, right? You can. That means you can do a lot more than you think. The skills in making theater are the life skills that you can to do anything. So that's Christina's piece. So basically, her little piece, the theater company said, do it. God bless Christina. She's the most hardworking person I know. So 3 months before we started, I started cutting and editing it, dramaturging it. We had 15 pages. First day of rehearsal, we had 30. Then we kind of expanded it, shaped it, and finally went up. And she worked very diligently, and then it became a passion piece. And it's a wonderful piece of theater, I have to say, because it's one of those things where not only what I've articulated, but the notion of the pandemic, how do we create communities with social media, and also during the time, the anti-Asian violence that was happening in the United States, what does it mean for her to kind of galvanize that movement too? Again, it takes an artist. So, write your piece. Any questions?
Any other questions? Yes, please.
I'd like to know, you talked a lot about rattling the cages, and it's not going to be easy. I hope this is not the last question because I don't want to end it on a downer. But could you share like some of the tougher times that you faced in this journey? Like what are some toughest experiences that you almost like I'm done, and then somehow you got yourself out of it? What was that process?
I never say I'm done. Because if you say you're done, then they've won. I would say I may have failed. But my friends, falling down on the floor is very easy. Getting up, that's the one that you need to figure out. They push you down, you get up. You fall down, it's fine. You learn how to get up. And you learn how to get up only because of one thing, because you have to do it. And for me, if it was for me, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. But I found it easier to do it for other people. If I fail doing this, the artistic directors of the next generation won't have it. So it's just easy for me to kind of shape it. You just have to figure out yourself a little bit. So if it's for me, then I feel like, well, then I can take a day off. But if it's for a community or for people, this play has to be done, because if it doesn't, some people are going to not hear this thing. So I think you need to find that raison d'etre that makes you do what you do. So to some extent, the art that you create has to have that reason for it to exist. Do not give up. I'm sorry, this life, particularly the theater, will teach you one thing. Rejection, rejection, rejection. And it's not going to get easy. Just know it's not personal. This person may not think you're right for the role. Doesn't mean that you're not a brilliant actor. It means that you're meant for something else. And when you find that, you realize this thing, it's like dating, right? Fuck it and call, right? His loss. You're going to find your own happiness in your own way. So I just think, no matter how dark it is, it's not only rattling, sometimes it's, can you open the cages so that other people can get out too? So find that reason, because I think, especially for, I don't mean to generalize again, I think if you're not Chinese in this country, it's maybe a little easier, because you have to understand that you are speaking for a community, your community, that really has no representation. So you have to fight even harder in a wonderful way, right? So the thing is, don't give up on that. Keep telling those stories. And if those people don't want to give you the space to do it, don't beg. You're inventive. How can you create your own theater companies? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm sure Ivan created a theater company because of a relationship that he had with another theater company before. And those are not uncommon. All these theaters start because as a reaction to another theater company, because they won't open those doors. And then next thing you know, the theater company will have its own chapter, and then another theater comes up. So I just want to say to you is, find your own spaces, and 5 playwrights can come together. Look, I don't know who's in the room, but if I can pick a few of you up, I assume some are writers, some are directors, some are actors. Is that not a theater company? What story do you want to tell that the other theater companies are not doing? And it's okay that the other companies are doing what they are doing. What are you doing? If you keep waiting, you're not going to get it done. And if you rattle those cages and you fall down and you get up, you do it. It's so satisfying to finish this one thing. And then the beauty of theater, I never realized this, is the most Buddhist thing I've ever done in my life. You work so hard to do something, a few weeks later, it's gone. You start again from zero. But what is this thing you've given? You've given to other people. So is that the Buddhist painting, it's like what, sand painting? You do it and you wipe it clean. There's something satisfying about that. So just know that these stories, even though they are ephemeral, they dig their claws into people who listen to them. And you know this because if you're all in the theater here, the reason why you're here is not because of some calling from Joan of Arc God thing. It's because you saw something that shifted your world. And all of a sudden you're lighter than air, and you want to always replicate that. It could be the sound of music, but it doesn't mean that you have to replicate the sound of music. You're replicating that feeling that you had, and you always will try to replicate it. And that's the joy, because you can never replicate it. You'll find different ways to do it. So don't worry about failure. It's actually part of it. If you keep succeeding and not failing, I really feel sorry for you. I really do, because I think when first you don't know what it is to fail, so at some point your work becomes kind of similar. I don't want to name names, but I want to give you a little exercise. You look at all those playwrights. I wouldn't name names. Look at all those playwrights who won those big awards in the first or 2 years. Where are they now? It's the long game. Same thing in the theater company too. I've learned too. It's not the small victories. It's the long game. What are you doing for the long game? It's your life. That's why I don't call it a career, because that means it has to be success and failure. It's a life. And you will all do wonderful things. Is that the end of it? Yeah.
I'm Jacqueline. I'm just curious, what made you choose like theater over film slash TV, which was different?
I think I found this out having worked on it at Columbia Pictures. It was great fun. I mean, Emma Thompson running in, all the celebrities running in. It takes a lot to make a film. And at the time, they were all white people, right? So, which is fine. And then you have your mini film industry, you try to do things. And I see John Singleton running in, doing a small film. I realized that by doing theater, it's actually a little faster. And to reach people directly is actually more visceral. Again, you need to find where the gold is for yourself. And some people should do film and TV because they actually love doing it. And there's another way of telling those stories in a beautiful way. And also technology has changed. I think you have to figure out what is the best form that you want to tell your stories. And also, you don't have to stick to one lane either. After doing the theater, when you feel excited that you've figured out storytelling, dramaturgy, like Glenn, then he'll do his film. And then at some point, come back to the theater, or I'm going to try TV. So as storytellers, form is just form. Are you a good storyteller? Because all the stories that you see, from novels to poems to film, and they have the same kind of ingredient. The only difference is you. Because I can give you the same variables for you to tell a story, but all of you will tell very differently because you have a very specific experience and specific life. So when you look at that story, it's going to come out your way. So you are, in a wonderful way, unique. There is no other person quite like you on this planet. So if you're not speaking your truth, telling your stories, you're wasting your time and hours. So do it, try different forms, and I'll also say this, is an opportunity to collide. Can you do a film and a theater piece together? I don't know. I'm just saying there should be no limitation. The only limits that you have are the ones that you place on yourself. Or producers who are too small-minded to think of something bigger. It's always a risk. And you have to have risk.
Yep.
If there's no risk, then I'm sorry. Have you seen enough plays, TVs, and film shows that in the first 5 minutes, you kind of know how it's going to end?
Yep.
That means dramaturgically, it's following a formula.
Correct.
There's no surprise. So you have to have the element of surprise and that uniqueness of risk. And look and think about the 5 films and 5 plays you love so much. There's a reason why you love them all. And they usually embody risk. And you're going to fail. And then you're going to realize the secret. And no one's going to realize this before. And the story is going to be told in a way that is astounding.
We have time for one more question there.
Hi. What are some new writing plays from America? I think because it's not so common that we get plays, and it seems like the publishing networks somehow don't get here.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come to online. So what are some new?
There are quite a lot. I mean, it's really hard for me to say. I would just say a couple of things. One is, you have the capability that we never had before. It's called the internet. Take a look at all the theater companies and see what they're doing. Find out who are the playwrights' names. And sometimes these playwrights have their own websites that you can actually reach out and just say, hey, you can just ask. And it's so nice to make a friend too, like a pen pal back in the old days. Listen, can I read this play? And also, there's some networks, like I think NNPN, New Play Network. Sometimes those little networks would have, these are the plays that people write, that you can actually read them. Don't be afraid to just ask to read them. And I think it's a good thing to read what other people are writing so that
Yes.
it kind of opens you up a little bit more to what the world may look like in terms of playwriting. Same thing in the UK as well. I hope that answers your question. So listen, thank you so much for this. I just want to say this. You are the future and the hope of Singapore theatre. I will only say this in the room for those here who have worked a little longer than you might have, is that the only wish they would want for you is to succeed and to shine. And they are available to you, I assume, and I know that they will be, if you only take a breath and reach out to these wonderful actors that you know, artistic directors and playwrights, and ask them for something. They are happy to open those doors for you because they do want you to succeed and to be better than all of us before. That's the point of why we do what we do. We do not want you to be lesser than or just as fine as we. And if those people that want you to be that, they're terrible artists anyway, and should be avoided at all costs. And who are those names? I don't know, but ask someone, right? Shine, tell those stories. You have a lot in this country. I mean, every time I come back, I always feel that there are a lot of stories that have not been told, and yet some people are telling it so beautifully. So there's a lot where it comes from. Don't give up on this, and create more opportunities to tell those stories. And please, it's a small community. Listen and help each other. You need each other more than you think. So I'm looking forward to seeing your work and getting comps for those shows. And thank you for being here tonight. Thank you.
Just as a final plug for Center 42, we try our very best. One of the raisons d'etre, Center 42 has just celebrated its 10th year, and we do as much as we can to support initiatives. We have writers coming to form their groups, mine Tulis being one of them, and we are trying to give space for people to gather. I think that's kind of important. For space for people to gather, we have limited resources, we do what we can, and I think if we have that sense of just gathering, getting together, and just communicate, form groups, come and talk to us. Right? I think there is a lot of possibilities to be had. It will be a long journey, and the thing of, you see, what is the thing that Singaporeans are scared of the most?
Failure.
Not the pandemic, it's failure. We're so scared of failure, cannot. That's why students get poor PSLE results and they jump. Don't be ruled by that fear of failure. It's terrible, I know, but we've been in a system where failure is unacceptable. Theatre is the only space where failure is acceptable. In fact, we celebrate it in that sense. So please, just come and reach out, take Chay's advice, reach out to people, don't work in isolation, read more plays. There is 60 years of Singapore plays that you can read, some really for a good laugh. You say, like that also can. But it's true. You look at it and say, that's quite interesting. And
I'll just say that those plays that may be laughable were important to people at the time.
So then you can appreciate that. Then you kind of thinking, how can this be this? Oh, it was 88. That was what it was like. And then there are all these theatre companies that don't exist anymore, and they did all sorts of stuff which you can gain inspiration from. I think that's kind of important. And again, if I could see more of the older kind of plays in the 90s getting revived or given a complete new spin, just letting people know these are the plays that were happening, it might be, again, very, very fruitful. So on that note, can you please thank Chay again?
No, thank you.